All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. This afternoon, we have our second panel of the Mapping Absence, Global Explorations of Disappearance in Art, Law, and Social Science, a multidisciplinary symposium that starts today, May 14th, and runs through May 19th in a hybrid format at Stanford University. This event is sponsored by the Tinker Fund through Stanford Center for Latin American Studies, with co-sponsorship from the Stanford Global Studies Workshop, Law and Literature in the Global South, the Division of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages, and the Departments of Anthropology and Art and Art History. We have the wonderful privilege of a conversation today with Derli Romero and Kimberle López. In this conversation, we'll kind of look at some of the artwork that Derli has created about artivism and migration, looking at Rostros Migrantes and also Mujeres en Tránsito. But I think this really creates a really powerful bridge to some of the conversations we had in our initial discussion, which focused on the kind of legal framings of disappearance, with a lot of emphasis on what it means to think about migrants who go missing in transit as victims of enforced disappearance. So there was a lot of discussion of some of the finer legal points, but also one of the things that came up frequently in the conversations was what are the different transdisciplinary and multimedia ways of thinking about enforced disappearance and thinking about the impacts of migration on marginalized communities. And I think Derli's recent project on Mujeres en Tránsito really brings into the primer plano, right, places in the foreground, the importance of thinking through a gender-specific lens when talking about migration and disappearance. And of course, there is a massive overlap between migration and disappearance. As we saw, for example, in the first panel, Graznia Baranowska discussed the importance of thinking through specific spaces such as the woods, the desert, thinking about the specific trucks used in the desert to cross the United States, thinking about the Sonoran Desert. Although we didn't talk about Jason De Leon's work, I think that very much could have been part of the conversation, or going further down into other parts of the Americas, right, the Darien. So I think this adds a really crucial element to the conversation that builds on, that strengthens, that expands the conversations we had this morning. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Derli and Kimberle. I just want to mention that we will have time for Q&A, and folks can drop questions in the Q&A function on Zoom throughout the presentation, and we can address them later in the panel. Also, folks will have the opportunity to raise their hand with the Zoom function, and I can promote them to panelists if they want to ask a question with their camera turned on. All right, and one last thing, Zoom now has a wonderful translation function that has been activated. So whenever we're speaking in English or Spanish, you can have that automatically captioned, and it worked surprisingly well. We used it this morning, and it was really quite fantastic, speaking in English and seeing the subtitles in Spanish. So I highly recommend that. You can find that activated in your Zoom. And our speakers today, Derli Romero is a printmaker with a PhD from the Doctorado Interinstitucional de Arte y Cultura de la Universidad de Guadalajara. Derli is a professor at the Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás de Hidalgo, where he teaches art. An author of several books, his artwork has been exhibited in group and individual exhibitions in Mexico and internationally. His current work focuses on the representation of Central and South American migrants crossing through Mexico. And Stanford is lucky to have pieces from Rostros Migrantes and now Mujeres en Tránsito, which will be displayed in its special collections on Monday, and also in part through its pop-up at the Center for Latin American Studies this Thursday and Friday. And Kimberle López is an associate professor of Latin American literature at the Spanish and Portuguese department at the University of New Mexico. Kim published Latin American novels of the conquest, Reinventing the New World, which examines colonial desire in a corpus of novels that rewrite the conquest of the Americas. Her research centers around gender and sexuality, ethnography, history and fiction, international adoption, human trafficking, and migration. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you both here today, and I will pass the floor over to Kim.
Okay, so just want to give a quick introduction to Derli's work. What he focuses on is humanizing migration and calling attention to it. It's not, I know that some of the other people are talking about solving problems of disappearance, but this is more about calling public attention to issues, um, particularly humanizing migration. This is an example of the dehumanizing of migration. ICE director wants to run deportations like Amazon crime for human beings, treating it like a business. He said he wanted to see a deportation process like Amazon crime, but with human beings. Also, part of the humanization effort is people who leave water in the desert, but then they've been criminalized. And this is an example of someone pouring out the water, an official pouring out the water that was left for migrants in the desert. Here's a woman officer kicking water. And here's an example of humanization. So dehumanization, rehumanization, seeing the human aspect. Rostros Migrantes was inspired by a workshop that Derli participated in Guanajuato several years ago, where there were several artists working on migration. And he went through several different phases before it became the project that is now Rostros Migrantes. Some of the artists there were textile artists. And I noticed that these like images of people running, it reminded me of this sign that I believe exists on streets in some parts of Southern California, where it's a caution sign to watch out for migrants who are obviously afraid, as opposed to this is a caution sign where a school crossing where people are walking and not afraid. So fear is clear in their body positions, in their running position. Rostros Migrantes is static in that it doesn't show this running, but the next project, Mujeres and Tránsito, does show this dynamic action of running. And again, the textiles, here was a project with another artist who was at the same workshop. So this workshop and working with the other artists on the topic, they were all working on the topic of migration, helped to inspire Derli's work, which eventually culminated in Rostros Migrantes. But it started with these drawings. He became interested in the profile, and he was printing text about migration on a profile, but this was his own profile. So he started working with the profiles of the migrants that he was meeting, and he interviewed them very briefly, very short interviews. And then he began printing the text of their interviews on their profiles. So this was the project that is known as Rostros Migrantes. It has the text of their stories printed on their profiles. So this is from a video on Rostros Migrantes, and it shows how he took the photos of their profiles and then made these, well, I'll explain a little bit about the process. So this is Derli. So what he did was he asked them for their used clothing and he gave them new clothes. And then with this clothing, he took their white t-shirts, particularly that were 100% cotton, and he made cotton paper, he made cotton pulp out of them. And with this cotton pulp, so this is a machine, he used these stencils. So he made the cotton pulp and then he dipped these stencils in it and made these outlines of their profiles. And then he printed their stories on the paper that he had made from their clothing. So this is the process that culminated in Rostros Migrantes, which is going to be exhibited at Stanford this week and also on Monday. There are 100 he interviewed 100 migrants, and there are 100 profiles, and Stanford has a complete collection of these. They have been exhibited, but in different ways, like on walls. But I had the idea that I suggested to Derli of hanging them like clothes on a clothesline. This is just them drying, but it wasn't seen as a way of exhibiting them. But I suggested to Derli that we try to exhibit them this way. And so we did a pop-up exhibit at the University of New Mexico, and in 2 rooms. These are some of the stories that are in this collection. And one of the things that you'll notice in regard to the topic of disappearance is that the violence in this case begins in the home country that they're leaving. And so the migrants often are leaving their home because of economic need, but also because of violence in their home countries. One of the things I wanted to point out also is that in Rostros Migrantes, there are more Central Americans from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala are the majority of them. Also, Mexicans crossing Mexico. The emphasis is on the crossing of Mexico and what they encounter there. And often they find violence and disappearances in Mexico, but also a lot of these disappearances begin in the home country, and a lot of the violence. So that's what they're trying to get away from, but it's also what they experience in Mexico. And one of the things that seems to surprise the migrants is that the people that are robbing them and sometimes kidnapping them are the police themselves. So I think that this might be surprising because even in their home countries, they are not used to expecting perhaps being robbed and kidnapped by the police. There's mentions of maras, of gang violence, and also the separation of families is something that we see in both projects. We see this also in Mujeres and Tránsito, that they get separated from people during their journey, and often in the kidnapping, they separate families. So the men and the women get separated. When they get separated, they often don't hear from these people again. And also families in the home countries, in Central America, in Mexico, also often don't know where the migrants have gone and never hear from them again. And one of the things that I think is relevant to the discussion this week with the legal aspects and different aspects is that psychologically it makes it hard, I think, to if they don't know if someone is dead, if they're just disappeared, then they may continue to search for them, but also it makes it hard to begin the process of mourning if they don't know what's happened to that person. So we talk about the stages of grief, but you can't really go through those stages if you still have the hope that that person's alive. So that must be something that I think people this week are interested in examining. They also talk about the people that rob them in Mexico, particularly police, and gangs, but they also talk about the people who help them and who give them a hand and who offer them solidarity, support, a roof over their head, some food to eat during their journey. So los mexicanos de buena conciencia. But the focus again in this project, in both projects, is the crossing through Mexico. So there is reference to the home country, there's reference to their destination, which is generally the United States. Some of them end up staying in Mexico, but the emphasis is on the crossing in Mexico. And what they find in Mexico is more violence, being robbed by gangs, but also by police, but also being helped in some shelters and people who lend them a helping hand. One of the things that we had pointed out to Derli when I saw this project and was going through the 100 faces was that only 2 of them were women. And so this was something that we pointed out to him. And as a result, he started this new project. And there are, that focuses exclusively on women. There are historical reasons. Migrant workers used to be mainly men or whole families, and they would cross the border and then come back seasonally. What makes that harder to do now is with the militarization of the border, it's harder to cross back and forth. So what that ends up doing is also meaning that people stay longer. But the other change is that rather than the women staying home, a lot of the women are single mothers who either leave their children with a relative or bring the children with them. And it's the women who are crossing now. At least almost 50% of migrants are women. And so that is the focus of this new project, Mujeres en Tránsito. Derli took photos of women in profile, but in a walking position. And then he made these plates, these wooden plates, and then printed from these wooden plates. So the plates are in negative, the text is negative. They're fragments of their stories are printed on them. And here we see the negative and the positive. And in these stories also we see kidnapping, extortion, and also separation of families, because when they would separate the men, they will separate the men and the women when they kidnap them, and then they need to try to find a way to find each other again. Here, this woman describes Mexico. She talks about crossing through literal jungles, but then she talks about Mexico as another jungle because of the violence that they're exposed to there. But the same people also talk about the human aspect of it, of the Mexicans who do help them. So again, the focus is the crossing through Mexico. One of the things that's different in this project is that the majority of the women that he interviewed for this project are Venezuelan. There's also one Haitian woman and one Garifuna from the mixed race population from Honduras that are descendants of slaves who mixed with other populations in Honduras. The separations of the family and how they get back together after they're kidnapped and they have to try to find each other again. And also the people who help them in Mexico. So we're going to see a video that talks about these stories. Here's an example of where they were kidnapped and extorted for money, told to run, kidnapped and taken into the mountains, and They didn't have the money, so they beat them and then they dumped them back on the road. Then they were robbed again by taxi drivers. This was the part about the Garifunas of Honduras, who are mixed race people who are descendants from slaves. This woman talks about how it's harder for Garifunas to find work and there are drugs. And she talks about a disappearance. Her son's father was taken alive. Here she said he was killed, but he was taken alive and they never heard from him again. There was no body found. So this was the point I was making about how it's hard to grieve when you don't know for sure if someone's dead, if they're missing, but you don't know whether to look for them or to start the grieving process. This was also the crossing through the jungle, being separated during the kidnapping. The husband is separated. He's at the Texas border while they're still in Mexico. So they're trying to get back together. And yeah. So I also wanted to, this was the part about separating and finding a way to communicate and come back together. The journeys that they make, this was the woman saying that Mexico is like another jungle. But there are also some compassionate people that they've met on their journeys. This was on the train showing how dangerous it is. They're trying to pass, when they're passing children back and forth from one train to another, and the train's about to take off. And they're passing this child from one train to another. And I just wanted to also mention a few projects that are similar to this one. So this is showing the process. This is in the video that we're going to see the process of how this came about. And this was an example of how we displayed it as a pop-up. This was in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago. Derli himself, this is the artist. This is a recent photo, but he himself was a migrant for 11 years. And so he has his own experience as a migrant. Here are a few projects that are similar to this in certain ways, that are tracking the journeys of migrants. This is a memoir of someone who in 1999, he was 9 years old and he crossed as well, he was not completely unaccompanied, but he had a coyote, but they got separated. And as I was mentioning, the increased militarization of the border in some ways keeps people in the United States more than, because they can't go back and forth seasonally. Here's another project at the border. It's called Playas de Tijuana, and it has photos of migrants, and they have a QR code where you can listen to their stories. There are lots of movies about migration and about detention centers. Joe had mentioned at the beginning, Jason De Leon, his undocumented migrant project. He's at UCLA, professor at UCLA. And one of the things he has are these toe tags. So this is also a physical, the comparison with the projects we're looking at today is that these are physical objects that these are people who are known to be dead. But then, of course, there are so many disappeared people that we don't know if they're dead. And then you can see how concentrated these are at the border, how many of these deaths are at the border. And of course, it doesn't help that people are putting out water bottles and other people are pouring out the water. Here's another project with disappeared people. This is also from the 1990s in Colombia, but Doris Salcedo has the shoes. She has exhibits of the shoes of women who disappeared in the 1990s in Colombia. And also at UC Davis, Robert McKee Irwin and Humanizando la Deportación is another project. There's another artist, a Oaxacan artist, 2501 migrantes, 2501 migrantes, and the un migrante is him. So Alejandro Santiago, who's now deceased, made 2,501 clay statues of migrants because there were 2,500 people from his town in Oaxaca. It's a town that only has about 600 people now, but 2,500 people left his town. And then the one is him because he wanted to experience it. So he paid a coyote to cross so that he would have the experience himself, like Derli, who also had been a migrant himself. And so Alejandro Santiago made these 2,501 statues that have been exhibited in Oaxaca. We had the fortune of being able to present this project in Oaxaca last year. We presented Rostros Migrantes, presentation about it. And in Oaxaca, we were there in March 2024, and it was during the International Women's Day. And I was able to take these photos of graffiti that women had put up. This was the cathedral, and they were denouncing, in this case, it says, put down our aprons and take up the rifles, that women, that the police are not taking care of them and they need to take care of themselves. And they denounce specific people, they name specific rapists and people that they feel are responsible for femicides. Saquen sus rosarios de nuestros ovarios. Get your rosaries out of our ovaries. Get your rosaries out of our ovaries. It rhymes in Spanish and in English. So that's all that I wanted to say. And I'm going to play the video. I also wanted to show a couple minutes of this, which is our, this was one of our pop-up exhibits that we did where we had the voices of the migrants playing while the students were hanging. Students are hanging this exhibit. And you can see the students hanging the exhibit and also hear the voices of the migrants while they're hanging it.
¿Alguna historia? ¿De dónde vienes? No, pues venimos de Honduras y el capitán la travesía que es un camino difícil. Cuando suben el tren, lo asaltan, muchos secuestradores abajo. El camino es bien difícil. Todo lo que uno sufre ahí. ¿Por qué te viniste? Por necesidad, situación económica en Honduras. No hay ni trabajo en Honduras. Está difícil la vida. Pues pregúntame. ¿De dónde vienes? ¿A dónde vas? ¿Qué... No, venimos de Honduras y vamos para el norte, para arriba, y la vida está dura en Honduras. Y venimos luchando ahí, días caminando, días en el tren, días que bebe agua uno, días que no bebe, come. Hay veces que le toca dormir hasta en el monte a uno. ¿Y cómo? Pues hay que luchar y seguirle para arriba.
So I just wanted to show that as an example of a pop-up exhibit. And then we're going to watch the video, which is about the second project, Women in Transit. So this was Rostros Migrantes. And one thing that you noticed was that a lot of the migrants that he interviewed for this project were Honduran, from El Salvador and Guatemala, as well as from Mexico. In this project, there are more women from Venezuela.
¿Sí o no?
Pasar por los retenes. De Guatemala rodeé todos los retenes, de ahí la frontera de Guatemala con México también. Pasamos el río caminando y nos subimos en una combi. La combi lo dejó en una cierta parte, ahí lo dieron que agarráramos una moto y ahí lo secuestraron. Estuvimos unos par de minutos, pagamos lo que ellos los decían, de ahí los soltaron, de ahí volvimos a agarrar combis, de ahí dejamos las combis porque ya no los levantaban, de ahí caminamos 6 días. 6 días para agarrar combis y taxi o moto. De ahí veníamos de pueblo en pueblo a llegar a Ciudad de México. De Ciudad de México llegamos hasta el basurero que le decimos nosotros. De ahí solo agarramos el tren. Para tener una nueva vida, comenzar de cero.
Derli, de Venezuela. Bueno, yo salí el 13 de diciembre de Venezuela. Llegué aquí el 29 de diciembre a Ciudad de México. De ahí, la travesía de aquí de México nos agarró un cartel, llegando ahí a Tapachula. Nos llevaron a un monte, nos secuestraron, nos estaban quitando $100 por cada uno. Como no los teníamos, nos golpearon hasta que nos sacaron después a la calle. De ahí volvimos a subir, llegando ya aquí a Ciudad de México, nos volvieron a robar.
Todos estos días. La he llevado al hospital de niños y ahí me la han atendido, gracias a Dios. Todos los garífunos viven en playas, en parte de playa, solo la bahía. Y a nosotros, bueno, los garífunos se nos hace más difícil, prácticamente no hay trabajo. Nosotros en nuestro pueblo vivimos de la pesca, de estar del siembro, o sea, del cultivo. Eso es lo que nosotros vivimos allá en nuestro país, los garífunos. Porque para nosotros no hay tantas oportunidades como otras personas. Pues. Y por ejemplo, allá en mi pueblo, porque nosotros somos de un pueblo, hay mucha droga, pero de nuestro mismo color. Prácticamente, por ejemplo, el papá de mi niño de 4 años, hace 4 años lo mataron. Eso pasó en la prensa. Se los llevaron vivos y hasta el sol de hoy no ha aparecido ni el cadáver ni nada, no se ha sabido nada de ellos.
Tuve el recorrido por la selva. Es una mala experiencia que vivimos como todos, para todos, cada experiencia es diferente. A muchos nos robaron, muchos fuimos abusados. Yo salí de Venezuela, salí con mis 3 hijos, mi esposo que hoy en día se nos separó por cuestiones de que los separan cuando nos secuestran, o otras sí nos separamos de familia. Él ahorita se encuentra en frontera de Texas. Yo me quedé sola con mis hijos, he venido batallando. No ha sido fácil camino. Nos ha tocado cosas de secuestro, robo. Y bueno, aquí seguimos en la batalla. Hemos pasado hambre. Hemos tenido que dormir mucho en el piso. Hay noches que nos acostamos sin comer. Millas que tenemos que caminar, que a veces los niños me dicen, mamá, ya no puedo más, y es fuerte, pues, tanto como para nosotros como para ellos es fuerte la situación, pues, porque para mirar de nuestro país no es fácil, a un mejor futuro no es fácil, la gente piensa que todo es fácil, pero no es fácil, es un recorrido. Nos hizo correr, nos separamos, nos hizo correr. Hoy en día nos encontramos acá porque, bueno, ayer nos bajaron del tren, nos agarró migración, nos hizo correr, nos separamos otra vez la familia, nos volvimos a unir y así hemos venido haciendo. Si tenemos que huir a la familia, a la migración le huimos, si no tenemos que separar, nos separamos hasta que nos volvemos a comunicar, nos volvemos a unir y así sucesivamente.
So these are the two projects that are going to be exhibited, and I stopped sharing now, and I'm muting.
Okay, thank you so much, Kim. I have a lot to say.
Or Derli wanted to speak.
Derli, please. Y Derli, ¿quiere hablar en español o en inglés? Da igual, podemos poner subtítulos, entonces como usted quiera.
I'm going to speak a little bit in English.
Excellent. Okay.
I have a presentation, but it's in Spanish and it's a little complicated to translate it. But I just wrote something short and easy to understand. Well, first of all, thank you to Stanford University, and thank you all to put everything together and invite us to the symposium. Well, as you know, my name is Derli Romero, and I am printmaker, and I am very interested in the production of books like this book. And lately, I finished a book named Women in Transit. I went to a few cities in Mexico, Irapuato, Celaya, and also in my hometown, Morelia. The images also have a text as a part of the figure from an interview of the 15 women. I think this is a message more powerful than the image by itself. One of the examples very well known is from Los Desastres de la Guerra de Francisco Goya, in which he uses the image and one text below the image. For this project, I got many help from my students of the University of Michoacán. They helped me to carve the plates and also helped me to print the images on cotton papers. Each box contains 15 different prints, all of them in black ink. The prologue was made by Kimberle López and the introduction by Sonia Rodriguez Hicks from the University of Wyoming. Well, I have not much to say, but I hope you guys enjoyed the video and the book. If you have any question, please let me know. The text is very long. It's about probably 10 minutes in Spanish, but I can.
Derli, ¿tienen un Google, Joe tiene un Google Docs que pueden compartir con todo el grupo?
Okay.
Yeah. Derli, if you'd like to share the text, we have a drive where we're sharing work from different symposium participants. And we can put it up there in English and in Spanish.
Okay.
Yeah. Or if there's something else you'd like to share with us now, of course, we'd love to hear it.
Well, now,
no pressure, no pressure. Escuché el híjole. I was like, okay, no, don't want to pressure.
I got it. Okay, now I need to share with you, right?
If you want, after today's event, I'd be happy to do a translation, to use DeepL, and then I would review it to make sure that it's coherent, and we can upload the original Spanish and the English for folks who are attendees to see after.
Can I read it in Spanish then? Or no?
Yeah, sí.
Oh, okay. En ocasiones interpreto que los nuevos caminos del arte llevan un destino con direcciones racionalistas, donde una cápsula de abstracciones es impulsada por el motor tecnológico, abriendo nuevos senderos para los numerosos adeptos a este modo imperante de producción y consumo digital reciente. La producción incesante se acompaña de cuestionamientos de hacia dónde nos lleva el aparente uso de tecnologías. El arte digital, dentro de su especialidad como medio, tiene múltiples aportaciones que requieren reflexionarse para descubrir su dirección y marca en el espacio artístico, pero sin dejar a un lado el papel crítico que nos detiene y nos abre a nuevos encuentros. Preguntémonos oportunamente, ¿en verdad lo digital nos libera conceptualmente como establecería la historia del arte, o solo nos prepara para exigirnos cada vez más a fuertes adaptaciones diseñadas para los usos de la tecnología? ¿Es un nuevo medio para el desarrollo humano artístico, o el medio terminará siendo funcional a otros propósitos distractores? ¿Podrá ser una extensión corporal del ser humano que se manipula en libertad, o es su grillete elástico? Entre estas dudas habrá muchas más para determinar si el alcance de lo que podemos expresar ahora con los medios artísticos es mayor a las posibles limitantes. Aún tenemos que acostumbrarnos a observar los valorizados píxeles a través de un cristal que emite luz y calor a nuestra vista. Precisamente, algunas materias como la arcilla, los huesos, el bambú, el papel, etc., que han contribuido por siglos en nuestra expresión y aprendizaje, tienen asimismo mensajes y valores que seguir aportando. Los libros del tiempo han requerido de recombinación entre materia y concepto. Me permito por ello mostrar a través del libro arte las posibilidades de crear una experiencia convincente en los interesados. Las vías de un artista para concretar las emociones, los pensamientos y abstracciones son tan múltiples como la combinación de materias y diseños conceptuales. El uso de superficies y materias en las artes visuales tiene un sentido vital para el creador en su liberación intuitiva. El ejercicio de plasmar pensamientos en una superficie permite primero la recuperación de lo aprendido, pero al escribir, por ejemplo, se desencadena en renovadas direcciones la creación de nuevo conocimiento. La escritura como registro se transforma en descubrimientos para quien la ejerce. Así, en la historia de la escritura, y mucho antes de esta, en la creación de signos y símbolos pictóricos, se comenzó a construir nuestra concepción del mundo, y continuamente se reescriben las posibilidades de lo que se entiende, se duda o se imagina. La salida que alguien da a sus impulsos creativos forma a su vez un camino de regreso para la materia, que también dicta con sus propiedades y estructuras las formas cargadas de energía a la intención del artista. Si bien lo observable es la manera como el ser humano proyecta la sensibilización de la materia, en otra perspectiva, la materia estructura las formas por las cuales el ser humano comprende e imagina. Por ello, es básico que la producción de la obra de arte se deba realizar a través de distintos materiales dentro de una interacción continua entre el ser humano y la materia. En mi trabajo de grabador, continúo desarrollando las características de la pulpa de papel y los acabados con textura para obtener una superficie receptora y mensajera que interactúa con sus delicados relieves en el trabajo final. En mi caso, el polivinilo, la madera, las placas de cobre y el aluminio han sido siempre el medio que delimita la estructura que permeará la tinta sobre el papel. En muchos momentos he decidido acompañar mi propuesta creativa de los significados históricos. El encuentro con eventos sociales de antes y ahora deja una carga emocional que motiva y lanza su influencia activa en mi trabajo. Dentro de ese eslabón histórico que nos ha tocado vivir, la llamada visión nacional o macro arroja datos y teorías que desdibujan el papel de los ciudadanos, quienes llevan su verdad sin tener ratings de acceso al público, como lo tienen algunos videobloggers de las plataformas virtuales. Es importante en estos días emprender la comprensión de lo general a partir también de casos concretos de personas y familias que permiten el ensamble e interrelación del tejido social. No solo desde un marco teórico se permite la aproximación a los contenidos de la realidad. La resistencia de los ciudadanos es tan creativa como los manifiestos del arte que exhiben la lacerante carga de un mundo que impone una modernidad separada y acosadora de las necesidades humanas. El planteamiento del artista es que puede construir su propia epistemología o manera de conocer. El conocimiento de nuestro mundo globalizado se forma a partir de lo que entendamos en nuestra región y lo que ocurre con nuestra gente. Con nuestra aportación en el mundo artístico, la recuperación de historias a nivel micro forma la expresión visible de la fase global en el ámbito de la cultura. La microhistoria posee un aspecto experimental que rearticula realidades concretas donde la historiografía normal se topa con datos accidentados y lagunas que le cortan el camino a las explicaciones ideológicas. Esta disciplina ha sustentado por medio de la invención los puentes entre lo documentable y la realidad que hace sentido, y abre la invitación a que el acto de crear se logre impulsar a su propio ritmo por los intersticios que la razón no cubre. Mis propuestas de libroarte recorren esas ramificaciones y se infiltran entre realidades concretas y las aporías que alimentan un sentido particular de percepción. Citando a Juan Viqueira, acerca de la microhistoria nos dice que se interesa en los hombres concretos y no en los fenómenos abstractos. Puede dar cuenta de cómo se engarzan fenómenos distintos para conformar una realidad única, y continúa. El enfoque microhistórico nos obliga a recordar que entre un fenómeno objetivo y otro siempre median lecturas subjetivas, y que las personas no reaccionan ante la realidad, sino ante lo que ellas creen que es la realidad y ante lo que piensan que ésta puede llegar a convertirse un día el día de mañana. Los hechos pasados se transforman en un presente que nos interpela y que nos exige una respuesta a través del prisma de un futuro posible, deseado o temido. Esta característica nos permite adentrarnos en distintas realidades históricas donde la subjetividad tiende puentes con más sentido que algunos rasgos objetivos cuantificados en estadísticas. Cierro la cita. La realización del proyecto surge de una realidad heterogénea que exige reiteradamente su humanización a través del arte. Otras artistas del mundo también reinterpretan la presencia ecológica y social de los tiempos modernos en sus creaciones. Bajo esta interacción he relacionado en mi caso distintas temáticas de los grabados de acuerdo a los materiales utilizados. Encuentro ecos en la obra de William Kentridge, donde se distingue la simbiosis entre el carácter de la obra con la realidad histórica y el entorno social presente. A través de los libros creados en el taller de grabado Nihilobstat, hemos explorado distintos lugares que aportan relato y han reconfigurado imágenes que retratan dentro de las posibilidades visuales aquellos temas que han sido inspiración y sorpresa en varios momentos. Se busca a la gente en su lugar y momento de acción para realizar la conversación, la entrevista y el registro documental de una realidad dinámica que no queremos su escape sin rastro. puede observarse en este libro arte que se convierte en portador de las palabras y rasgos de conjuntos de personas sin primacía en las noticias. Bueno, aquí hablo de Rostros Migrantes, pero me paso adelante y dice, los movimientos migratorios tienen distintas causas que generalmente van a estar relacionadas en la mayoría de los casos con el rezago socioeconómico de familias que no ven otra opción para escapar del círculo de la pobreza. Por un lado, los niveles salariales se mantienen en niveles bajos que desgastan al trabajador. Por otro, los cambios organizacionales y tecnológicos van asegurando el crecimiento de una población excedentaria que no puede insertarse en el esquema productivo de manera benéfica y sirve como palanca de presión a favor de los dueños del capital. El sistema económico expulsa e infla el globo poblacional de desempleados con un tumor corporal. La ganancia se antepone a la preservación de cualquier recurso orgánico o inorgánico. Un desplazamiento por violencia o por algún foco de contaminación de su lugar de residencia tiene presente la amenaza y bien identificado al agresor de su condición de vida precaria. En cambio, el neoliberalismo tiene la sofisticación de responder a todos el mensaje de que las medidas tomadas por el gobierno son para mejorar la economía, cuando bases sólidas para el desarrollo de México. A través de tantos anuncios y discursos me percato de que la certidumbre que el poder transmite es un disuasivo bastante efectivo para disipar la toma de conciencia social. Mujeres en Tránsito es un proyecto relacionado con la migración. Colaborativo. Contiene un prefacio de Kimberle López y una introducción de Sonia Angélica Hicks en respuesta a 15 grabados en relieve creados e impresos por Derli Romero en el taller Nihil Obstat de Michoacán, Morelia. Deseo agradecer a las 15 mujeres migrantes que colaboraron en este proyecto y metafóricamente ayudarlas a cruzar fronteras y compartir los sueños y sus palabras con todos ustedes. También es importante mencionar a mis colaboradores sin que este trabajo se hubiera prolongado por años. A Luisa Sendejas, a Nancy Fraga, Iker Padilla, a Cari Sandoval, Sonia Rodríguez, Kimberly López, Adriana Pineda, Luis Vázquez, Claudine Exum, Francisco Robles, Alexandra Noriega, Paloma Paco, Dulce Lemos, Génesis Pablo, Mariana Ramírez, Alejandro Saavedra, Alejandra Salgado, Jairo Torres y Rogelio Vargas, todos ellos aportando su granito de arena para concluir este proyecto. Ese sería todo, porque ya...
Sí. I just wanted to say in English really quickly. So one of the things he talked about was subjectivity as opposed to statistics. The micro narratives are subjective. They're also temporary. They're people that are just passing through. So as far as some of the people from this project that are involved in the Stanford symposium may want to know about, like tracking that he's not tracking the people. He meets them once, he doesn't keep in touch with them. And this aspect also, the material of paper, Derli, el papel es temporal también. So it's delicate, it's fragile, it's not lasting. It's not even like Alejandro Santiago, his statues de barro that can be put outside a la intemperie and can survive outside. So they're, este material es delicado, es frágil, es temporal. Right?
Well, thank you both very much. I mean, this is a truly powerful and wonderful complement to continue the conversations we started earlier. While I'll offer some brief reflections on the points that you and Derli have brought up. And in the meantime, I would love to invite folks to either drop a question in the Q&A or to raise their hand as an attendee, and I can promote you to panelist if you'd like to ask a question without your microphone. Y pueden dejar su pregunta en inglés o en español, como quieran. Pueden levantar la mano digital en Zoom y yo los haciendo a panelista para que puedan hacer la pregunta con la cámara puesta. I just like to kind of summarize some of the points here. You know, one of the things we talked about earlier was thinking about migration and what the law can register. and what the law doesn't register. And I think this is one of the key things we see in your work, Derli, and in the presentation that you gave us, Kim, right? These kind of historical roots, this kind of longue durée of processes of racialization, colonization, and also climate refugees, right? That are very much part and parcel of the different routes of migration. And we see the changing patterns of who is migrating and who Derli has encountered and collaborated with in his work. We also see this really important notion of kind of the fragmentary, right, and the kind of negative through the woodcut. And I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had between the woodcut and in the use of clothes and cotton in the previous project. Also really appreciate, Kim, that you brought Derli's work into this kind of narrative ecology with other artists, other folks who are doing different types of works that do two types of tracking work, folks that have kind of memoirs and personal histories that they brought. So I really appreciate that. I also really think this is important kind of counter narrative to big data, right? So if we've kind of many places and many folks, we've kind of internalized unconsciously this kind of mode of thinking through algorithms because they are so present in a place like Silicon Valley, where I am right now. I think this is an important way of thinking about other ways of telling stories, of other ways of thinking about the construction of data and archives through this idea of arte as epistemología, art as epistemology, as Derli so eloquently put it. I would love to hear more about also the mobility of these pieces versus the mobility of human beings, right? Look how this work goes across borders with the fluidity, right? That is so precisely denied to so many human beings, right? With this kind of massive assemblage, to use Jason DeLeon's terms, of non-human actors to create dangerous conditions that kind of is in confluence with human actors that create the vulnerability of migrants in general and women migrants in particular. I really appreciate in the video and in your discussion, Derli and Kim, the focus on hands, right? The hands that make possible this project, the hands that make possible this longer history of the Bracero program, right? So focusing on this specific aspect, I think really opens up a lot of ways to think about how we construct visibility and generate social awareness. I think the intertext with Goya is really fascinating. And I'm thinking also of someone working in Mexico right now across media, like Veronica Herber Bisecci, right? Who is thinking of the relation between text and image. So I think Goya is a really powerful interlocutor. The one that always stuck with me is Fuerte es la cosa, right? And then Alejo Carpentier really makes a lot of this in thinking about the French Revolution from the Caribbean. So I think there's all these really powerful conversations to really center the longue durée as part of the story of these temporal shifting moments that you're giving us, Derli, in this artwork are really part of these long historical processes. And I think that's a really powerful complement to the legal discussion. So again, feel free to raise your hand, those who are in the audience, or drop a question in the Q&A. If not, I'd be happy to throw a question out there now. I would just love to hear more, Derli, the difference between using the clothing, la ropa, and then the paper, the papel, in this wood cutting, el grabado, in this new project. So I really am very curious about the technica, the medias, and why you chose these different forms.
Well, I think I've been making paper for about 10 years, and I just get tired. My back got tired of doing this process all the time, hundreds of times. No? And of course, I'm getting old, I know, but now in this Women in Transit, I prefer to use regular paper made by machines, because it's much easier for me to just to print and save all the hard work from paper making. That's the reason.
I think it really does add a really important aspect, right? The physical embodiment of the artist at work in collaboration with all these other people is indistinguishable from this process, right? These aren't bodies that are separate, right? And I think maybe that's a beautiful piece of this art, is to make us think through our own embodiment and how it's related to these kind of larger supply chain issues, as folks here can think about, right? We have Hector Hoyos here on the panel, who I know could add on that. I really do appreciate that. And I think that's an important part of thinking through collaborative art, but also understanding the vulnerability of migrants as part of these things that make everything we're using in a particular contemporary moment possible.
Yeah, that's why I mention all these people that helped me in this project because I think this is important. To know that I didn't do it by myself. You know? I need some help from other people for collaboration because this is once you get more and more older, it's more hard to do it by yourself. You know? When I remember when I start my first book, I produce the paper, I print, I make the poems, I make the images, everything, you know. But now I just try to get people to get people to get involved in, in projects, you know. And also this is important because all the students, it's like a lesson to them. You know? They learn from the examples. You know? It's important.
So, I mean, that pedagogical aspect, but also thinking about it as the other side of the coin, right? So it's two sides of the same coin. So it's not as simple as there's an artist singular making this work, just like there's not a single state bad actor that you can point to and then everything will resolve itself, right? The vulnerability of migration, the problem of disappearance and forced disappearance are not resolved through toppling, let's say, a dictator in the particular moment, thinking about the case of Mexico, because the diffusion of actors involved and because of these long durée historical structures that have led to precisely the vulnerability of migrants.
Also at when we've done the pop-up exhibits, I feel like it's very important to involve the students in hanging the exhibit, that it's not just something that they see, but that they touch and they're involved in it.
Absolutely.
So on both ends of the process have a learning experience.
And we have a question from Sonia, who asks, how do these projects or art make the general public aware of the difficulties of migration? If Derli or Kim, you'd like to take this. So Sonia again asks, how do these projects and art make the general public aware of the difficulties of migration?
Well, one thing I wanted to say was that the exhibiting, one of the issues that we had with Stanford, or that not Derli, but when I first met Derli, he mentioned that Stanford had a complete collection of the 100, and this was years ago, like 3 years ago, and they had never been exhibited. So that was one of the reasons that I wanted to make sure that they got exhibited, because just having them in an archive, I don't feel is having them locked in an archive doesn't help.
Yeah, I think that we cannot change the world, but at least we collaborate with some grain, you know. It's like if this book get exhibited in some place, the students, the people can be aware of the situation that migrant people suffer, you know.
Absolutely. And this is, you know, one of the classic questions of thinking of the relationship between art, aesthetics, empathy, generating social consciousness and awareness. What are the ways we create pressure points and through kind of civil society more broadly to change laws, of course, but also beyond that, right? This is something we've talked about quite a bit, is there's many, many ways to create the social change, and the legal function is a crucial part of it, but it is certainly not the only part. My suggestion would be that we stop the recording, and that way we can have an informal discussion for those who are still able to stay. I know many folks have lots of obligations. Classes are starting now. So we'll stop the recording here if that works, and then we can continue chatting. And that way, if folks who want to informally ask a question without the pressure of the recording can feel free to come into the Zoom. So thank you again.
Thank you, Joe.
And Kim, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.